Hello and welcome to the Espresso Insiders podcast. Today we're going to be discussing 10 common coffee brewing mistakes and how you can avoid them. It's very easy to get bogged down in all of the detail of how to brew your coffee the best way, especially when it comes to espresso. Okay, let's dive into it. So, number 1, using the wrong grind size. Now, this is such a common mistake that coffee lovers make, especially when they're at home and they're not quite sure how to get the right grind size for the equipment that they're using. So the general rule of thumb when it comes to grind size is that the longer the contact time of the grounds with water, the coarser you're going to grind the coffee, and the shorter the contact time, the finer you're going to grind the coffee. Without getting too technical, this is to make sure you optimize the extraction of coffee oils from the coffee grounds and into your cup. So for example, if you're making Turkish coffee with an Ibrik, or you're making espresso, or even something like an AeroPress, you're going to want a very fine grind size. However, if you're making something like cold brew or a French press, where you're going to leave the coffee grounds to steep continuously for quite a long period of time, then you're going to want to grind the coffee a lot coarser. This is so you don't over extract the coffee and end up with a really bitter and horrible tasting cup. Unfortunately though, the way that you're going to get the right grind size for the brewing method that you're using is basically through trial and error. Now, whilst this is going to result in some wastage, the way to reduce waste when you're grinding coffee for your given brewing method is to follow simple guides online like I've provided in the show notes below. I'd recommend opting for something in the middle of what you think is right, dial up and down from there. The second mistake to avoid is using the incorrect coffee to water ratio when it comes to brewing coffee. Most coffee brewing methods call for 1:16 ratio of coffee to water. We've talked about extraction when it comes to grind size, but ratio is also important when it comes to getting the perfect extraction of your coffee. If you're using too much coffee and not enough water, you're going to have an overpowering and bitter tasting cup. Whereas if you use too little water, it's going to be weak and sour. Using too much water is going to result in under extraction, whereas using too little water is going to result in over extraction. The best way to resolve this issue is to use a kitchen scale to measure out exactly how much coffee you need and how much water you need as well. Okay, the third mistake you want to avoid is not pre-wetting your coffee grounds. This is also known as the bloom phase and is commonly used for pour over and French press. If you go ahead and pour a load of water onto your coffee grounds without letting the CO2 dissipate from the coffee, you're going to end up with a more bitter tasting cup and an uneven extraction. Touching on extraction again here, key is not only to optimize the right level of extraction for under versus over extraction, but you also want to make sure that you're having an even contact time with all of the coffee grounds and the water that you're pouring over. The way to resolve this is to pour a small amount of water over the coffee grounds for about 30 seconds before brewing fully to make sure you've extracted as much of that initial CO2 as you possibly can. This will ensure you get a more balanced and full-bodied flavour. Okay, the fourth mistake you want to avoid when it comes to brewing coffee at home is brewing with water that's way too hot. Now this might sound a bit counterintuitive because obviously you want to pour hot water over coffee grounds to extract as many of those essential coffee oils as you possibly can. But if you wait for 30 seconds to a minute after your kettle's boiled, you'll let the brewing water temperature reduce to around about 95 degrees. This is perfect for extracting as much of those coffee oils as possible, but not burning and over extracting the coffee grounds. Another way to help protect your coffee is to pour a small amount of cold or room temperature water over them just before you're about to pour over the hot water from the kettle. Number 5, using stale coffee beans. This is a big mistake that home brewers make because they just simply pick off the first thing they see in the supermarket rather than actually researching how they can get fresh beans at home. This doesn't have to be a complicated process though, because you can definitely find fresh coffee beans in local roasteries, coffee shops, and even online. Stale coffee beans basically have had a lot of time for their flavour to dissipate over time, and this just means you're going to get a much weaker and more bland tasting cup of coffee as a result. What I'd recommend is buying in small batches and grinding whole beans for yourself rather than buying pre-ground beans that have been sat in the supermarket for months. Yes, you'll need to invest in a good quality grinder, but this is a small price to pay for the amount of joy you're going to get in the morning from having freshly ground coffee beans. Number 6, using tap water rather than filtered water to brew your coffee. This might sound like overkill, but the amount of difference that having freshly filtered water makes when you're brewing coffee is huge. When you think about it, over 95% of what you're drinking is water at the end of the day. And especially if you live in a hard water area, one of the biggest variables that you can reduce the impact of when you're brewing coffee is the water. I'd recommend getting a water filtered jug and using this every time you brew your coffee. Number 7 is not extracting your coffee evenly. Now we've talked about over and under extraction a lot in this episode already, but when it comes to even extraction, what this is referring to is allowing the coffee grounds to have as much even contact with the hot water as possible, rather than having channeling and localized extraction within your coffee bed. This applies to espresso, mocha pots, pour over coffee, and even the French press. Now what you want to make sure is that as many of the coffee grounds are getting as even a distribution of the hot water as you possibly can, so that you're not having really sour or bitter tasting coffee as a result. The best way to ensure this is the case is that 1, you pour water over your coffee grounds evenly, and 2, if you're making espresso, you do a bit of puck prep to make sure that the coffee grounds are not packed down in an angle before you tamp or unevenly distributed. Okay, the 8th common mistake you really want to avoid when you're brewing coffee from home is not cleaning your coffee equipment regularly. This might sound like a straightforward thing to avoid, but you'll be surprised at how many times coffee brewing equipment gets neglected, oils build up and they go rancid. Things like mocha pots, French presses, even Chemexes and V60s really do benefit from regular cleaning, and obviously it goes without saying that if you have an espresso machine or a bean to cup machine, you should use cleaning tablets as regularly as you can. Another tip when it comes to cleaning is to really make sure you dry everything properly before you go ahead and store your coffee equipment away in the cupboard. This is going to make sure you minimize the impact of damp or any mold growing on your coffee equipment, because let me tell you, that is the last thing you want when you're brewing your morning coffee. The 9th mistake you really want to avoid when it comes to brewing coffee is using a poor quality coffee grinder. But the real big step up that you can make when it comes to grinding coffee is switching out your blade grinder for a burr grinder. A blade grinder is more useful for mixing spices rather than grinding coffee, whereas a burr grinder is going to ensure you get a much more even distribution of coffee grounds. Whilst burr grinders are more expensive, they're well worth the investment. Okay, the 10th and final mistake you're going to want to avoid when you're brewing coffee from home is ignoring the brew time. Brew time will vary from brewing method to brewing method, but it's definitely important and is one of the key variables that will impact your extraction. Whilst I also recommended earlier that you use a weighing scale, it's also really important to make sure you time your coffee brewing to make sure you know how long it's taking for the perfect extraction to take place. For example, if you're using a French press, maybe try doing a 5-minute brew versus a 10-minute brew and see what the difference is. One will definitely be more extracted than the other, and you might want to find a happy medium in between. The same goes when it comes to espresso. You're obviously looking for that 2-to-1 golden ratio when it comes to espresso, and one of the key areas that you can control when it comes to dialing in and out your grind size is the amount of time that it takes to extract that weight of coffee. For example, for espresso, you're going to be aiming for anywhere between 25 to 30 seconds, depending on the machine you're using, but this rule also applies to all the other brewing methods mentioned. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed the episode and you've learned something today in how to avoid 10 of the most common coffee mistakes when you're making coffee at home. Remember to share this with your friends if you found it useful, and I'll see you on the next one.